Only a fool solves it your way. The words rang through the elegant boardroom before Annie could stop herself. The entire room went silent. No one moved. A second later, Richard Whitmore slammed his palm onto the polished glass conference table so hard that 3 coffee cups rattled and coffee splashed over their saucers. He shot to his feet. "What did you just say?" he thundered. "Who exactly are you calling a fool?" Annie stood near the end of the table, both hands still holding the silver coffee tray. Every eye in the room turned toward her. Lawyers, crisis consultants, public relations executives, assistants, analysts. For more than an hour, they had talked only about numbers, risk percentages, compensation costs, settlement ranges, media strategy, and narratives that needed to be controlled. Annie took a breath. Her voice trembled slightly, but every word was clear. "I meant you." The room seemed to freeze. "I'm calling you a fool, Mr. Whitmore, because only a fool would handle this situation that way." A low murmur rose from the far end of the room. Did she really just say that to him? She just called Richard Whitmore a fool. "She's finished," a young associate whispered. "Nobody talks to him like that and keeps their job." Across the room, Martha Collins, the head of communications, kept her eyes fixed on Annie. "Let her breathe," she said quietly. Richard turned sharply toward her. He gave a cold laugh. "Let her breathe?" "Martha." "She just walked into a fire carrying a can of gasoline." Martha did not change expression. "I don't think she did." Richard turned back to Annie. His jaw was flushed with anger. "Do you know where you are standing?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know who I am?" "Yes." He stepped closer. "Then you should understand that the people sitting in this room have spent 30 years solving problems you probably cannot even define." Annie tightened her fingers around the silver tray. A spoon touched a coffee cup with a tiny metallic sound. She looked straight at him. "Maybe that is exactly the problem." Someone near the end of the table let out a smothered laugh. Richard's eyes swept across the room, and the sound disappeared instantly. The crisis had started with a failed compensation program. Whitmore's home safety devices had malfunctioned, causing damage to homes across several states. Richard's plan had looked perfect on paper. Replacement devices, gift vouchers, printed apology letters, and safety kits. But reality had been different. Packages arrived late. Some arrived broken. Some were addressed to the wrong people. Some were missing parts. One family opened a box and found a cracked device wrapped in cheap plastic beside a letter that began, "Dear valued customer." Now Richard was trying to handle the crisis the same way he handled everything else. Money, lawyers, pressure, and silence. Richard did not take his eyes off Annie. "David," he said, "tell her what we're doing." David Kane, the company's lead attorney, leaned back in his chair. He was nearly 60, wore rimless glasses, and spoke with the smooth precision of a legal contract. "We are increasing compensation by 20%. The revised response letters have been reviewed by legal. We are requesting the removal of misleading videos. We are also preparing a media campaign to reshape public opinion." Annie looked at him. "Reshape public opinion?" David frowned slightly. "That is the professional term." Annie shook her head. "No, that is the expensive way of saying you are hiding the problem." A few people glanced at one another. Richard gave a dry laugh. "Interesting. She has opinions." "I have eyes," Annie replied. She placed the coffee tray on the side table. One cup had gone cold, with a thin dark film floating across the surface. Then she pointed toward the large screen. "You keep acting as if the problem is that people are talking about this," she said, looking directly at Richard. "It isn't. They are talking because you gave them no other choice." Richard narrowed his eyes. "And what do you know about consumer crisis management?" He grabbed a thick stack of reports from the table, walked toward her, and stopped right in front of her. "Do you see this?" he asked, holding up the files. 86 pages from legal, 42 pages from an outside crisis firm, consumer psychology reports, media data, loss projections. "Do you understand any of it?" Annie did not step back. Richard shook the stack of papers. "This is what adults use when a billion-dollar company is in crisis. Not emotions, not speeches, and not lessons learned from angry people online." "Richard," Martha said softly. He ignored her. "Tell me," he continued, pointing the reports at Annie, What do you know that my lawyers don't know? What do you know that my board doesn't know? What do you know that I don't know? Annie looked at the papers. Then she looked past them, toward the screen. Her voice became very quiet. I know none of those pages actually apologizes to anyone. The room went completely still. I know that every time you throw more money at this, people hear you saying their pain can be bought. Every legal threat you send tells the public the customers were right. Every polished media statement tells them no one is truly sorry. David pushed his chair back. That is just emotional nonsense. Annie turned to him. No. That is the part your strategy forgot. Richard slowly lowered the papers. You think this is about feelings? Annie answered at once. I think people stop buying because of feelings, especially people who already know what it feels like to be ignored. Martha leaned forward. Annie, what exactly are you trying to say? Annie looked at Richard. He is trying to solve a human problem, as if it were just a debt to be paid. She lifted her head, and her eyes moved around the room, and everyone else is too afraid to tell him the car is heading straight into a wall. No one spoke. No one moved. Martha whispered, Annie, but it was already too late. There was no going back now. Richard's smile slowly faded until it disappeared completely. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes turning cold. So this is your opportunity, Richard said. 3 minutes. Stand in front of everyone here and tell us how you would solve the problem that my company, my legal team, and my communications department have been arguing about all morning. Martha spoke softly. Richard, don't do this. No, he cut her off immediately. If she's bold enough to criticize me, then she should be bold enough to prove she's right. 3 minutes. That was all the time he gave Annie. Richard leaned forward, his voice lower now, colder than when he had been angry. You wanted to speak, didn't you? Then speak. You have 3 minutes to explain what, according to you, everyone in this room has failed to understand. The phrase failed to understand weighed heavily on Annie's chest. I never said anyone was incompetent, she replied calmly. Richard's jaw tightened. Annie raised her hand and pointed at the screen. I said your approach is the problem. A few people shifted uneasily in their seats. David Kane immediately lowered his eyes to the stack of documents in front of him, as if the conversation had already crossed a line. Only Martha Collins remained still. She looked at Annie with a strange expression as if watching a tiny spark land on a pile of dry wood. Richard took another step closer. Fine. Go on, Miss Carter. What exactly is the problem? Because apparently, you've turned my boardroom into a classroom. Annie looked up at the large screen. The company's latest press release was still displayed beside a stream of public responses. Thousands of comments. Anger. Disappointment. Some sounded so exhausted they were almost hopeless. She pointed at the statement. This is the problem. David frowned. The statement? Yes. It was reviewed by legal. That's exactly why it sounds lifeless. David's expression sharpened immediately. Watch your words. Richard raised a hand to stop him. It's fine. Let her continue. Annie took a deep breath. The statement says that Whitmore Consumer Group acknowledges isolated delivery issues affecting a limited number of customers. David nodded. That statement is factually accurate. Annie looked directly at him. But it's insulting. The room fell silent. People's homes were damaged. The shipments that were supposed to help them recover arrived broken, delayed, incorrect, or handled carelessly. Yet your official response sounds like something generated by an automated system. At the far end of the table, a young employee quickly lowered his head, but Annie still caught the slight tightening at the corner of his mouth as if he agreed. Richard noticed it too. His gaze swept across the room. Does anyone else share her opinion? No one answered. Annie did. They do. She looked directly at Richard. They're just afraid to say it while you're standing there. Martha's pen stopped moving. Richard stared at Annie without blinking. This time, the anger on his face was no longer burning. It settled and became something more dangerous. You have 2 minutes and 30 seconds left. Annie nodded, even though her hands had already started trembling. The issue is no longer the shipments, she said. That was only the beginning. She paused. The real crisis started with your response. The room was completely silent. You're trying to make people stop talking, instead of giving them a reason to stop being angry. David opened the file in front of him. We'll increase compensation. Annie looked at him. That only proves my point. David frowned. How does increasing compensation prove your point? Because you think every wound has a price. No one spoke. Richard remained still, not blinking. Annie continued. If someone's package was damaged, replace it. If someone lost money, compensate them. She lifted her head, but that only resolves the transaction. It doesn't heal the hurt. Richard let out a quiet laugh. Hurt? Yes. He looked at her. Do you have any idea how much a class action lawsuit could cost this company? Annie answered immediately. Do you know the price of being looked down on? If this moment touched you and you believe respect matters more than money, please like this video, leave a comment telling us where you are watching from, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories. David sat up straighter. This is emotion, not strategy. It's both, Annie said quietly, and that's exactly what everyone here is missing. At that moment, Martha truly looked at Annie for the first time, not as the intern assigned to sit near the wall and take notes, not as the young woman who brought coffee into meetings, but as someone who had just said the one thing everyone in that room had been avoiding all morning. Richard slammed the stack of reports onto the table. The papers hit the wooden surface with a heavy thud, instantly silencing the entire room. These are reports from top experts, he said, his voice controlled but firm. Market analysts, legal advisors, crisis management consultants, people who understand the pressure businesses face. Annie flipped through a few pages, her eyes scanning the dense numbers and charts. Maybe they understand pressure from shareholders, she replied calmly. Richard frowned. And you think you understand it? Annie did not answer immediately. Instead, she turned and pointed directly at the screen behind her. The real pressure comes from being ignored. A quiet murmur spread through the room. Before anyone could stop her, Annie continued, her voice clearer now. Take a look at these comments. Not everyone is asking for more money. Many people are saying the same thing, just in different words. She paused for a few seconds before continuing. Did anyone ever read my complaint? Did anyone ever look up my name? Did anyone actually care about what happened after the product failed? Annie's eyes swept across everyone in the room. That's what people are really angry about. Richard turned toward the screens. The live dashboard still rolled in real time. Angry comments. Customer videos. News alerts. Stock trackers. The crisis was still moving while everyone inside the room had stopped. He stared at her, not at the badge on her blazer, not at the coffee cart behind her. At her, the silence stretched long enough for Martha Collins to push back her chair. I'll call digital, she said. Richard did not answer. Martha picked up her phone anyway. Josh, conference room now. Bring live stream support, and stop all promoted posts immediately. A voice crackled through the speaker. All of them? All of them. David Kane stood up so fast his chair rolled backward. Martha, don't do that. She looked at him. Richard already decided. No, Richard listened. That is not the same thing. Richard finally moved. He walked to the window overlooking Manhattan. 38 floors below, yellow cabs crawled through traffic and people moved between buildings with coffees in their hands, unaware that a billion-dollar company upstairs was trying not to collapse under the weight of its own apology. He spoke without turning around. How bad is it? David exhaled. You want legal numbers or real numbers? Both. David opened his folder. Real numbers first. 43,000 customer complaints in 36 hours. 7 states considering inquiries. 4 major retailers asking for internal reports. 3 investors requested emergency briefings this morning. Martha stopped typing. Richard still faced the window. And legal? If another video goes viral tonight, class action firms will start circling. One of the consultants shifted uncomfortably. Annie stayed where she was. Richard turned halfway. The stock? Down 6% since open. The room went quiet again. 6% for Whitmore Consumer Group was not just money. It was headlines. Board calls. Investors asking whether leadership had lost control. David closed the folder. This is exactly why public emotion cannot drive strategy. Annie looked at him. Then what should drive it? Risk. People are the risk now. David opened his mouth. Richard lifted one finger. The lawyer stopped. Martha glanced toward Annie. Walk me through it again. David looked annoyed. We already heard it. No, Martha said. We heard the summary. I want the order. Richard finally turned from the window. Annie swallowed. Okay, she said. First, stop trying to defend yourselves. David sighed loudly. Annie ignored him. The public already thinks the company is hiding. Every legal notice confirms that fear. Every paid ad looks fake. Every polished statement sounds like distance. Martha nodded slowly. Second, Richard speaks directly. David rubbed his forehead. Still terrible. Annie continued anyway. No podium, no company backdrop, no teleprompter. People know when executives are reading. They can hear it. Richard crossed his arms. And I just improvise? Yes. That sounds like a disaster. Not if you tell the truth. A young analyst near the door muttered under his breath, "She really doesn't care who he is." The woman beside him whispered back, "No, I think she does. That's why she's saying it." Richard heard neither. His attention stayed on Annie. "And after I apologize? Then you prove it." "How?" "Customer calls. Real ones." David laughed this time. "No executive is calling thousands of customers." "Not thousands," Annie said. "Start with the worst cases." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Who decides that?" "The people who answer the phones." That got Martha's attention. Annie stepped closer to the table and pointed at the customer service dashboard on one screen. "These people know exactly who got hit hardest. The families that called 5 times. The older customers stuck on hold. The people posting pictures because nobody called back." One of the customer support managers sitting near the wall slowly nodded. Richard noticed. "You agree with her?" The man hesitated. "Sir, answer." He straightened. "Yes, sir. We already have a priority list." David looked over. "Why wasn't this in the report?" The man looked uncomfortable. Nobody asked. Nobody spoke after that. Richard looked toward the dashboard again. Nobody asked. The words stayed in the room. Martha lowered her eyes. Annie watched Richard carefully. The anger was still there, but something else had appeared beside it. Embarrassment. He hated it. A knock came at the door. 3 people from Digital entered carrying laptops and camera gear. One of them, a thin guy in his 20s named Josh, stopped when he saw the room. Are we filming?" Martha answered first. "Set up for live stream." Josh blinked. "The CEO live stream?" "Yes." David muttered. "God help us." The Digital team started moving. A camera went up near the center wall. Lights stayed off. Annie noticed Martha intentionally keeping the setup plain. No logo wall. No branded background. Just the conference room. Richard noticed too. "Why no backdrop?" Martha answered while checking the feed. Because she was right. The room looked at Annie. Martha kept working. "A backdrop says company. This room says accountability." David stared at her. "You've known this girl for 6 hours. Long enough." Richard walked back toward the table. He stopped in front of Annie. "You understand something, Miss Carter?" "Yes, sir. If this goes badly, everyone in this room will remember whose idea it was." Annie met his eyes. "If it goes badly," she said quietly. People were already leaving. Richard held her gaze. Then Josh looked up from the laptop. "We're ready." No one moved. Richard looked at the camera like it was a courtroom witness. David stepped closer. "Last chance to reconsider." Martha folded her arms. Annie stayed silent. Richard loosened his tie. "Everyone out except communications." David frowned. "Richard, out." The room began to clear. Consultants packed papers. Executives whispered on the way out. Near the door, Annie heard someone say softly, "If this works, that girl just changed her life." Another voice answered, "If it fails, she won't even make it to next week." The door closed. Now only Richard, Martha, Annie, Josh, and 2 Digital staff remained. Richard sat in the chair facing the camera. He looked uncomfortable, not because of the crisis, because there was nowhere to hide. Martha checked audio. "Ready when you are." Richard looked at Annie. "What exactly do I say?" The question surprised everyone. It surprised him too. The most powerful man in the building had spent all morning giving orders. Now he was asking. Annie walked toward the camera setup. Nothing polished. Richard waited. "Don't talk like a CEO." "What does that even mean?" Annie looked at the customer videos still frozen on the wall. "It means stop talking like the company." Martha slowly lowered her tablet. Richard sat back. For a moment, nobody moved. Then he looked at Annie again. "And if I don't know how?" Annie answered without thinking. "Then start with sorry." The room went still. Richard looked away first. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan kept moving. Inside, the man who owned the tower sat in silence before a camera he suddenly feared more than reporters, investors, or lawsuits. Because cameras remembered. And for the first time that day, Richard Whitmore was about to speak without hiding behind anyone else. Richard looked away first. Outside the glass walls, Manhattan kept moving. Inside, The man who owned the tower sat in silence before a camera he suddenly feared more than reporters, investors, or lawsuits. Because cameras remembered, and for the first time that day, Richard Whitmore was about to speak without hiding behind anyone else. He sat back in the chair and loosened his tie another inch. "Everyone else leaves," he said. Josh looked at Martha. Martha nodded. "Digital stays." The two remaining assistants gathered their tablets and stepped out. The door closed behind them with a soft click. Now the room felt smaller. Richard looked at the camera again. "How many people are watching this if we go live?" Josh checked his laptop. "If we push to all company channels immediately, maybe a few 100,000 in the first hour. News accounts will pick it up." David Kane, still standing near the window, muttered, "Fantastic." Richard ignored him. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. "What happens if I say the wrong thing?" Annie answered before Martha could. "You already did." The room went still. Josh stared at his keyboard. David closed his eyes briefly. Richard looked at Annie. "You really don't know how to stop." "No, sir. You understand most people would be terrified right now?" "I am terrified." "Then why do you keep talking?" Annie glanced at the frozen customer videos. "Because they don't get to." Richard followed her eyes. A family standing beside a damaged replacement shipment. An older man holding paperwork in one hand and a cracked device in the other. A woman filming from her kitchen saying nobody had called back. Richard leaned back slowly. Martha stepped closer with her tablet. "The longer we wait, the worse this gets." David shook his head immediately. "No. The longer we wait, the more time legal has to contain exposure." Annie looked at him. "Contain what?" "The situation." "No," Annie said. "The people." David turned sharply. "Young lady, you have no idea how these things work. And you have no idea how they feel." "That is not my job." Annie nodded once. "That's the problem." Richard suddenly stood. Everyone stopped. He walked toward the giant screen and stared at the comment feed moving down the side, still waiting for someone real to speak. "Stop hiding behind statements. Did anyone even call these families?" He read another one. "My father is 72. He sat on hold for an hour." Richard looked away. "Who handles customer escalations?" A woman near the back raised her hand. "Nancy Miller, customer relations, late 50s, quiet all morning." "My team, sir." Richard turned. "How bad is it?" Nancy hesitated. David stepped in. "Richard, this isn't the time." "No," Richard snapped. "It's exactly the time." Nancy straightened in her seat. "We have priority lists," she said. "Customers who called multiple times. Elderly customers. Cases involving property damage. Families still waiting for replacements." Richard frowned. "And where are those reports?" Nancy lowered her eyes. "We send summaries upstairs." "Summaries?" "Yes, sir." Richard looked around the room. "Did anyone read them?" Nobody answered. Martha slowly put her tablet down. Annie watched Richard's face change again. Not anger. Not yet. This looked closer to shame. He walked back toward the table. "How many priority cases?" Nancy opened her laptop. 312. "How many received executive callbacks?" Silence. Richard looked up. Nancy answered quietly. "None." The room felt colder. Richard rubbed his jaw. "Fine," he said. "We start there." David stepped forward immediately. "Richard." "Absolutely not." Richard turned. "You think I should do nothing?" "I think you should stay strategic." Annie spoke softly. "People call it strategy when they don't want to say fear." David looked ready to explode. Richard lifted a hand without even turning. "Enough." David stopped. Richard looked at Annie. "You said I call them." "Yes." "The worst cases first?" "Yes." "And you think that changes anything?" "No." Richard frowned. "It changes you." Nobody moved. Even Josh stopped typing. Richard stared at Annie for several seconds. Then he pulled out a chair and sat again. Camera on. Josh looked up. "Now?" "Now." The red light blinked alive. Richard sat motionless. Martha stood beside the monitor feed. Annie remained behind the camera. David stayed near the window with both arms crossed. Josh counted softly. 5 seconds. Richard inhaled. 4. His hand tightened once on the table. 3. The room stopped breathing. 2. Richard looked straight into the lens. 1. The live stream began. For 2 seconds he said nothing. Thousands joined immediately. Comments started rolling. "That's him. He actually came on. Let's hear the excuse." Richard opened his mouth. "My name is Richard Whitmore." His voice sounded different without microphones and stages. Smaller. Human. I'm the CEO of Whitmore Consumer Group. Comments moved faster. Get to it. Say sorry. He swallowed. Annie saw it from behind the camera. He looked down once, then back up. Our company failed, people. The room went silent. David's head lifted. Martha stopped moving. Richard continued. We sent compensation packages meant to repair harm. Some arrived damaged. Some arrived wrong. Some made things worse. Comments slowed. Richard looked directly into the lens. We hurt people who trusted us. Annie felt the room shift. Not dramatically. Just enough. Richard kept going. And I am responsible. David closed his eyes. Martha lowered her head. Josh whispered under his breath. Oh my God. The comments changed. Wait. Did he just admit that? That sounded real. Keep talking. Richard glanced toward Annie for half a second. She nodded once. He turned back. Today we begin calling affected customers directly. Senior staff included. We are replacing damaged shipments immediately. We are opening dedicated support lines. And I will personally review the highest priority cases. Nancy from Customer Relations looked up in surprise. Richard had never done that. Never. The comments kept moving. My mom waited 3 days. Please call Indiana. Do not make promises you won't keep. Richard read them. He did not look away. I know some of you won't believe us yet, he said quietly. That is fair. The room remained still. Trust is an ode. We have to earn it back. Martha looked toward Annie. Annie kept her eyes on the monitor. The stream passed 100,000 viewers. Then 200. News alerts started appearing on the side feed. Whitmore CEO goes live during crisis. David saw it first. This is already everywhere. Richard kept speaking. He looked tired now. Not polished. Not rehearsed. Just tired. And strangely, that seemed to help. Comments shifted again. At least he showed up. First honest thing today. Let's see if they do it. Richard finished. We will update progress publicly. He paused. Not because we have to. His eyes moved briefly toward Annie. Because hiding got us here. Silence. Then Josh whispered. We're at 400,000 viewers. Nobody celebrated. Nobody moved. Richard stared at the monitor. The room watched the comments continue. Not forgiving. Not praising. Just waiting. And for the first time all day, waiting felt better than attacking. Richard stood slowly. He looked at Annie. You were right about one thing. David turned. Martha did too. Richard kept his eyes on Annie. This isn't over. Annie nodded. No, sir. Richard looked toward the customer dashboard. Good. He loosened his tie again. Because now we actually have to do the hard part. Richard loosened his tie again. Because now we actually have to do the hard part. The live stream was over, but nobody moved. The comments still rolled across the monitor beside the playback window. At least he showed up. Call my parents next. Don't disappear tomorrow. David Kane stared at the screen like it had betrayed him. We should shut comments down, he said. No. Annie answered immediately. David turned. Why not? Because they're talking to us now. They're attacking us. No, Annie said. They're testing us. Richard stayed seated. His eyes were still on the monitor. The playback had frozen on his own face. He looked older on screen than he did across the table. Josh checked the numbers again. 530,000 viewers. Nobody celebrated. Nancy from Customer Relations spoke carefully. The support inbox is changing. Martha looked up. Changing how? Nancy refreshed her screen. Less anger, more requests. People are asking if the callback program is real. Richard stood. Then make it real. David looked at him. Richard. No. The answer came fast. Richard walked toward the center table and pulled the customer dashboard onto the main screen. 312 priority cases? Nancy nodded. Split them. She blinked. Sir? Group by severity. Property damage. Elderly customers. Families still waiting. I want names. David stepped forward. Executives cannot start making personal calls. There are protocols. Richard looked at him. Good. Write new protocols. The room went quiet again. Nancy opened another file. The highest priority group has 42 cases. Print them. Josh quietly whispered to Annie. Is he serious? Annie kept watching Richard. Yes, she said softly. I think he finally is. The printer outside started running. Paper after paper. Names, addresses, case notes, complaint histories. Richard took the stack himself. He flipped through the pages. The first file stopped him. Customer waited 71 minutes on hold. Second replacement shipment delayed. Third complaint unresolved. He turned the page. Elderly customer. Lives alone. Still no replacement delivered. Richard looked up slowly. Who reviewed these? Nancy lowered her eyes. Middle management. And after that? Regional directors. And after that? Silence. Richard understood. Nobody important had ever looked. He set the file down harder than intended. Martha watched him carefully. Annie watched him too. The billionaire who had spent all morning talking about exposure numbers was now reading names. There was a difference. Have felt it. Phones, Richard said. Nancy frowned. Sir? Bring phones. David rubbed his forehead. You cannot be serious. Richard ignored him. Nancy rushed out. Martha turned toward Annie. What now? Annie looked at the stack. Now they show up. Martha smiled faintly. 10 minutes later, the room looked different. Phones lined the table. Customer files spread everywhere. Digital staff tracked incoming responses. Nancy assigned cases. Richard sat at the center. David remained standing, arms crossed like a man attending his own nightmare. Nancy handed Richard the first file. Indiana. He took it. Family home damaged. Elderly father. Replacement delayed twice. Richard looked at the number. He hesitated. Annie noticed. Call. He glanced at her. You make it sound easy. No, Annie said. I make it sound necessary. Richard hit deal. Everyone listened. One ring. Two. Three. A man answered. Hello? Richard straightened unconsciously. Good afternoon. My name is Richard Whitmore. Silence. Then the man laughed once. No chance. It's really me. Long pause. The room held still. The man spoke again. You're the CEO? Yes, sir. Another pause. Well, the voice said quietly. Took you long enough. Nobody moved. Richard looked down at the file. You're right. Across the table, David closed his eyes. The call lasted 8 minutes. No speeches. No legal wording. Just questions. What happened? Did the replacement arrive? What do you still need? When it ended, Richard put the phone down. He looked tired. Nancy handed him another file. Ohio. Elderly customer. Package damaged. No callback. Richard looked at it, then slid it toward Martha. Your turn. Martha blinked. My turn? You wanted communication. She stared at him for 2 seconds. Then, took the file. The room slowly changed. Phones lifted. Calls started. Digital staff logged notes. Customer service joined. The giant conference room that had spent the morning building defenses was now doing the one thing nobody had planned. Listening. Annie stood near the wall. Nobody asked her to bring coffee anymore. Josh walked over quietly. You started this. No. Yes. She shook her head. They did. Josh looked around. Executives on calls. Nancy directing teams. Martha writing notes beside customer names. Richard listening instead of speaking. Josh smiled. Then you changed it. Before Annie answered, another staff member rushed into the room. Martha. She looked up. The sentiment tracker. Martha crossed over. The screen refreshed. Negative mentions were still high, but something new appeared. CEO called my father personally. They actually reached out. Let's see if they follow through. Martha stared. It moved. Nancy looked over. What moved? Trust. Nobody spoke. Richard looked toward the screen. The comments kept coming. Not praise. Not forgiveness. Just less anger. He looked at Annie. Still think I'm a fool? Several heads lifted immediately. The room waited. Annie smiled a little. No, sir. Richard raised an eyebrow. You changed your mind that fast? No. Annie looked at the phone spread across the table. I think a fool would have kept hiding. Richard held her gaze. Then he looked down at the next customer file in front of him. He picked up the phone again. Who's next? Nancy checked the list. Michigan. Elderly couple. Shipment lost. Richard nodded once. Give it to me. And for the first time that day, nobody in the room looked surprised when he said it. And for the first time that day, nobody in the room looked surprised when he said it. The calls continued. One after another. Michigan. Indiana. Ohio. Pennsylvania. Some customers were angry. Some suspicious. A few thought the calls were fake and hung up immediately. One older man in Indiana made Richard repeat his name 3 times before believing him. You're really the CEO? Yes, sir. Then where were you yesterday? The room went quiet again. Richard looked down at the file. Not where I should have been. Nobody expected that answer. Not even Annie. The old man on the phone was silent for a second. Then he said, "Well, that's the first honest thing I've heard from your company." Richard ended the call 5 minutes later. He did not move right away. The customer file remained open in front of him. Nancy approached carefully. "Next case?" Richard nodded. Before she could hand it over, Josh looked up from the analytics monitor. Everyone?" Martha turned. The sentiment dashboard had changed again. Negative mentions still led the chart, but another line was climbing fast. CEO apology response. Live callback reactions. Human response. Martha walked closer. "What's the engagement?" Josh swallowed. "Higher than the paid campaigns." David scoffed. "That means nothing." Josh kept reading. "Actually, it means a lot." Richard finally looked up. Josh rotated the screen. Posts filled the feed. Midad just got a call back. Still mad, but at least somebody finally listened. This is the first time they sounded human. One comment sat at the top. "I don't need perfect companies. I need companies that answer the phone." Nobody spoke. Martha quietly sat down. Annie stayed near the wall. She should not have been here anymore. An hour ago, she had been the intern with the coffee tray. Now nobody was asking her to leave. Richard read the comment again. Then another. Then another. The room door opened. A young assistant hurried in. "Mr. Whitmore?" He looked up. "CNBC wants an interview." David stood immediately. "Absolutely not." The assistant continued. "Two networks called. One wants a follow-up statement." Richard looked toward Annie. David noticed. "Richard." No answer. Richard kept looking at Annie. "What do you think?" Half the room lifted their heads. Even Annie looked surprised. David spoke first. "No more appearances. We stabilize first." Martha folded her arms. "He already appeared. That was damage control." "No," Annie said quietly. Everyone turned. "That was accountability." David let out a breath. "We are not turning a crisis into a listening tour." Annie looked at him. "No, we're turning it into repair." Richard leaned back. "And the interviews?" Annie thought for a moment. "No interviews." David relaxed. Then Annie continued. "Yet." David frowned again. "You keep calling this a media crisis," Annie said. "It isn't." "What is it then?" "A trust crisis." Martha nodded slowly. Annie stepped closer to the screen. "Media follows emotion. Right now, people aren't asking for another camera. They're asking if today was real." Richard watched her. "So? So prove it." "How?" "Finish the calls." Nancy looked at the remaining stack. 268 cases left. Richard followed her eyes. He exhaled. "That many?" Nancy nodded. "Yes, sir." He loosened his tie again. David checked his watch. "Richard, the board call starts in 40 minutes. Richard looked at him. "Move it." David blinked. "The board?" "Yes." Silence. "You're postponing the board?" "I'm talking to customers." Nobody in the room reacted immediately. Nancy actually smiled before catching herself. Martha looked down to hide hers. David stood frozen. Richard noticed. "What? You've never postponed a board call." Richard looked at the files. "I've never done a lot of things today." Annie looked away. For some reason, that sentence hit harder than the apology. Josh's screen chimed again. Another alert. He frowned. "Wait." Martha turned. "What?" Josh enlarged the feed. A new post had gone viral. The screen filled with a video. An older woman sat at her kitchen table holding her phone. "I just got a call from Whitmore," she said. The room listened. The CEO himself called. Richard straightened. The woman smiled a little. "I'm still upset. But today somebody listened." The video ended. Silence. The comments underneath were already exploding. "Maybe give them a chance. Keep watching. See if they follow through." Martha slowly sat back. David looked irritated. Richard looked unsettled. Only Annie understood why. Praise was easier than hope. Hope came with responsibility. Richard looked toward the stack again. "Next file." Nancy handed it over. He took it without checking the title. "Who is it?" "Elderly couple, Michigan." He nodded. Before dialing, he looked toward Annie. "You said something earlier." She blinked. "What?" "You said they don't need money first." Annie nodded. "They need to feel seen." Richard looked at the phone, then at the file. Quietly, he said, almost to himself, "I think I'm starting to understand." He hit dial. Across the room, Josh watched the analytics rise. Martha reopened her notes. Nancy prepared the next case. David stood by the window looking like a man losing an argument he had won his whole career, and Annie remained near the wall, still wearing the same badge, still technically an intern, but nobody in that room saw her that way anymore. Not after today. Not after the richest man in the building had started asking her what to do next. Not after the richest man in the building had started asking her what to do next. The calls continued into the afternoon. The conference room no longer looked like a war room. Papers were everywhere. Coffee had gone cold. Ties were loosened. Laptops stayed open beside customer files instead of market reports. Richard finished another call and rubbed his eyes. How many left? Nancy checked the board. 234. Richard leaned back. Feels like we already called 5,000. You called 28, Nancy said. Martha looked up from her laptop. Actually 29. You forgot the Pennsylvania callback. Richard sighed. Fantastic. Josh suddenly straightened at the analytics station. Wait. Nobody reacted immediately. Then his face changed. Guys. Martha turned first. What? Josh enlarged the social feed. A new clip had exploded. It was not from Whitmore. It was from one of the customers Richard called. The video showed an older man sitting in a recliner. I argued with that CEO for 6 minutes, the man said. Still don't trust him. But he stayed on the line. The comments underneath were moving fast. My company would never do this. Keep calling people. Don't stop halfway. Richard stared at the screen. Then another alert appeared. A second customer post. This one from Michigan. A woman holding a replacement shipment. They called us. Real people, not scripts. Josh turned slowly. Sentiment just jumped 8 points. David immediately walked over. Show me. Josh moved aside. The dashboard refreshed again. Negative, still dominant. Neutral, rising. Positive, climbing. Trust recovery indicator active. David frowned. That's impossible. Josh shrugged. Apparently not. Martha crossed her arms. People respond when they're treated like people. David looked annoyed. No, people respond to momentum. Annie finally spoke. Momentum from what? Nobody answered. Because everyone already knew. Richard was still staring at the customer videos. He looked unsettled again. Not because the strategy was failing. Because it was working. A knock came at the door. The assistant from earlier stepped in carrying a tablet. Mr. Whitmore. Richard looked up. Board members are waiting. They want you now. David straightened immediately. There. We're done here. Richard did not move. The assistant continued. Sir. They sounded upset. Martha quietly returned to her screen. Nancy sorted the next files. Nobody looked at Richard. He understood. The room was waiting. He looked at the stack. 234 names. Then at the tablet. Then back at Annie. What would you do? David closed his eyes. Annie looked surprised. You're asking me? You keep answering. The room went quiet again. Annie thought for a second. Take the board call. David nodded immediately. Then Annie continued. Bring them here. David turned. What? Richard looked at her. Why? Because they think this is a crisis report. She pointed at the room. It isn't anymore. Richard followed her eyes. Phones. Customer files. Nancy on support logs. Martha tracking public sentiment. Josh updating responses. Real work. Messy work. Human work. Annie looked back at him. If they're deciding the future of the company, they should see what fixing it actually looks like. David shook his head. No board member is coming down here. Richard picked up the tablet. Invite them. David stared. Richard. Invite them. The assistant hurried out. David stepped closer. You're changing the chain of command in the middle of a crisis. Richard looked at him. No. He glanced around the room. I'm changing what we call important. Nobody spoke. Even David stopped. 10 minutes later, the board arrived. 5 people. 3 men. 2 women. All older. All expensive. All confused. One of them stopped at the door. What happened here? The conference room looked nothing like executive headquarters anymore. Files covered the table. Phones lined every seat. The giant screen displayed customer names and callback status. Nancy stood with a headset. Martha had removed her jacket hours ago. Richard looked toward them. We're working. One board member frowned. On what? Before Richard answered, another phone rang. Nancy looked down. Priority customer, Ohio. Richard reached for it automatically. The room watched. He noticed. Then picked up anyway. Richard Whitmore speaking. Silence. The board members slowly turned. The call lasted 4 minutes. When it ended, one older woman on the board spoke quietly. Was that really a customer? Yes. And you called them? Yes. The woman looked around the room again. Her eyes stopped on Annie. She still stood near the wall, still wearing the intern badge. The board member asked, "Whose idea was this?" Nobody answered immediately. Martha looked up. Nancy did too. Josh tried not to smile. Richard turned. Annie almost wished he wouldn't. He pointed directly at her. "Hers." The room went still. One board member blinked. "The intern?" Richard nodded. "The intern." Annie felt every eye land on her. One of the board members looked genuinely confused. "She proposed all this?" Richard glanced toward the customer dashboard. "No." He looked back at Annie. "She reminded us what we forgot." Nobody moved. Not even David, because everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. The company had not forgotten logistics, or media, or legal exposure. It had forgotten people. Richard picked up the next file. "Who's next?" Nancy checked the list. "Ohio again." He nodded. "Give it to me." The board members sat down without being asked, and for the first time since arriving, none of them mentioned the stock price. The board members sat down without being asked, and for the first time since arriving, none of them mentioned the stock price. Richard picked up the Ohio file. Nancy handed over the notes. Customer waited 4 days for replacement. Damaged compensation package. Multiple unanswered requests. Richard nodded and hit call. The room stayed quiet. An older woman answered. "Hello? Good afternoon, ma'am. My name is Richard Whitmore." A pause, then a tired laugh. "Another one?" Richard frowned slightly. "Another one? You're the third person today." The room looked up. Nancy immediately checked her screen. The woman continued. "Customer service called. Somebody from shipping called. Now the CEO?" Richard glanced toward Nancy. She shook her head. "Not us." The woman kept talking. "I appreciate it, really. But I don't need 3 phone calls. I need the replacement my husband's been waiting on." Silence. Richard looked down at the file again. The replacement status still showed pending. He ended the call 4 minutes later. Nobody spoke immediately. Then Martha stood. "Who else is contacting customers?" Nancy already knew the answer. She typed quickly. Her face changed. "Oh no." Richard turned. "What?" Nancy swallowed. "Regional offices." David frowned. "What about them?" "They launched independent recovery teams." Martha stared. "Without approval?" Nancy nodded. "They started after the live stream." Josh pulled up internal messages. More notifications appeared. Midwest Region Outreach Program. Emergency Customer Recovery Initiative. Southern Division Fast Response. Richard's face hardened. "They're doing their own thing." Nancy nodded again. "Everyone's trying to help." "No," Annie said quietly. The room turned. "They're trying to protect themselves." Richard looked at her. She pointed at the dashboard. "Look, different teams, different messages, different promises. No coordination, no timeline. One customer got 3 calls. Another got none. One region offered replacement shipping. Another promised gift cards." The room slowly understood. Martha sat back down. "We're splitting the response." David spoke first. "That's manageable." "No," Annie answered. He turned. "It becomes another crisis." Richard folded his arms. "Explain." "Because people compare notes." She walked toward the main screen. Customer A gets 3 calls. Customer B gets silence. One family gets overnight shipping. Another waits a week. She looked back at him. "Tomorrow the story won't be Whitmore apologized." Nobody moved. "It'll be Whitmore plays favorites." The room went cold. Josh refreshed social media. A new post appeared. "My neighbor got called." "We didn't." Another. "Still waiting in Michigan." Another. "Why them and not us?" Martha cursed under her breath. David stepped forward. "Fine. Freeze regional programs." "No," Annie said. David looked annoyed. "You disagree with everything." "No." Annie pointed at the dashboard again. "Keep the teams." Richard narrowed his eyes. "Then what?" "Unify them." Martha stood. "How?" Annie thought for a second, then looked at the whiteboard behind the room. She picked up a marker. At the top, she wrote 3 words. "We show up." Nobody spoke. Annie turned back. One message. She wrote beneath it, "One team, one promise, one standard." Nancy slowly stood. Annie continued. "No separate campaigns, no local slogans, no regional fixes. She wrote again. Call. Replace. Follow through. That's it. Richard watched the board. Josh took a picture. David still looked unconvinced. This sounds like branding. No, Annie said. It sounds simple because people forgot simple. The older woman from the board finally spoke. The same woman who had asked who Annie was. What happens if we can't reach everyone? Annie looked at her. Then we tell the truth. The woman nodded slowly. Richard remained silent. He stared at the board. We show up. No corporate language. No legal wording. Just action. Martha looked at him. I think she's right. David sighed loudly. Everyone thinks she's right. Richard still said nothing. Josh refreshed the feed again. His eyes widened. Nancy looked over. What now? He enlarged the screen. A clip from the live stream had gone viral. Not the apology. Not the promise. One sentence. Trust isn't owed. We have to earn it back. 7 million views. The room fell quiet. Richard looked at it, then at Annie. You put that in my head. No. He raised an eyebrow. You did. Annie shook her head. The customers did. Richard looked back at the screen. The board members watched him. One of them spoke quietly. Richard. He turned. The man adjusted his glasses. You should listen to her. Nobody expected that. Not David. Not Martha. Not even Annie. The board member continued. I've been doing this 40 years. Every company loses money sometimes. He looked at the customer files. But the dangerous thing is when people stop believing you care. The room stayed still. Richard slowly looked back toward Annie. The intern badge still hung from her blazer. Sama badge. Sama person. Nothing about her had changed. Everything else had. Richard walked to the whiteboard. He picked up the marker Annie left behind. Below we show up, he wrote one more line. No customer left unanswered. He stepped back. Make it official. Martha nodded immediately. Nancy already started typing. Josh prepared the rollout. David looked like he had lost a court case. Richard handed the marker back to Annie. You started this. Annie shook her head. No, sir. Richard looked toward the customer dashboard. No. He glanced at the wall of comments. We ignored this. Then he looked at her again. You made us stop. Nobody spoke. Because everybody in that room knew it was true. The crisis had not changed because of money. It changed because one person refused to stay quiet beside the coffee cart. The crisis had not changed because of money. It changed because one person refused to stay quiet beside the coffee cart. Nobody said it out loud after Richard spoke. Nobody needed to. The room had already changed. Phones kept ringing. Customer files moved from one side of the table to the other. Nancy coordinated support teams, while Martha drafted the new internal directive. We show up. No customer left unanswered. Richard stood near the whiteboard reading the words again. He had built companies his whole life, acquired them, restructured them, sold some, saved others, but he could not remember the last time 3 handwritten words on a whiteboard unsettled him more than a quarterly loss report. Josh broke the silence. We've got another issue. Everyone turned. The analytics screen refreshed. New complaints. Ohio. Several posts at once. Nancy frowned. What happened? Josh opened the first video. An older woman sat at a kitchen table. Behind her hung family photos and a faded American flag folded into a display case. She held up a damaged replacement unit. My husband served this country 30 years, she said. I waited 4 days and got this. The room listened. The woman continued. Now everybody's calling, but nobody fixed this. Silence. Josh looked at the file. Customer name, Helen Brooks. Nancy checked immediately. Priority case. Richard looked up. Was she called? Nancy hesitated. No. The room went still. Richard turned. You said priority. She was assigned regional follow-up. Assigned? Nancy swallowed. Not completed. The answer landed hard. Richard looked at the board. No customer left unanswered. Then back at Nancy. Get me the file. She handed it over. Retired nurse. Ohio. Multiple calls. Replacement failed. Awaiting executive review. Richard read the notes twice. Martha quietly asked, What's the video reach? Josh answered without looking up. 9 million. David exhaled slowly. There it is. Nobody asked what he meant. Everyone understood. One more viral customer. One more wave. The crisis was not over. Richard looked at the phone in front of him, then at the file, then unexpectedly at Annie. She gets the next call. Annie blinked. Me? No. He picked up the phone. Us. The room fell silent again. Richard sat. He placed the file between them. Nancy handed over the number. Richard looked once at Annie. "You talk if I screw this up." Annie almost smiled. "You mean when?" For the first time all day, Richard laughed. Short, tired, real. Then he dialed. 1 ring. Tfo. 3. The call connected. "Hello?" The voice was older, steady. Richard straightened automatically. "Mrs. Brooks?" "My name is Richard Whitmore." Silence. Then came the answer. "I know exactly who you are." Nobody moved. Richard continued carefully. "I'm calling because your replacement shipment." "No." He stopped. Mrs. Brooks's voice remained calm. "You're calling because my video reached 9 million people." Richard looked down. The room stayed frozen. "No, ma'am." Another pause. "Then why now?" Richard opened his mouth. Nothing came. For the first time that day, he had no prepared answer. No statement. No strategy. Only silence. Annie watched him, then quietly leaned closer. "Tell her the truth." Richard glanced at her. Mrs. Brooks waited. He looked back at the phone. "Because we should have called before the video." The room stayed still. Mrs. Brooks did not answer immediately. Richard continued. "And because you were right." Nancy stopped typing. Martha slowly lowered her pen. Richard looked at the file. "We failed you." Silence again. Then Mrs. Brooks spoke. "My husband used to say companies stop listening when they get too big." Richard said nothing. "He passed 3 years ago," she continued. The package came with his name on it. The room dropped into silence. Nobody had known that. Richard closed the file. "I'm sorry." Mrs. Brooks laughed softly. Not cruelly, just tired. "You know what hurt the most, Mr. Whitmore?" Richard looked at Annie, then back at the table. "No, Mom." The box wasn't broken. The room remained quiet. It was realizing nobody checked. Annie looked down. Across the table, Martha removed her glasses. Mrs. Brooks continued. "I worked 32 years as a nurse. You learn the difference between mistakes and not caring." Richard sat still. "I thought your company stopped caring." Another pause. Then she added quietly, "Today I'm not sure anymore." Nobody moved. Not Richard. Not Annie. Not even David. Because that sentence carried more weight than every dashboard in the room. Richard spoke carefully. "We're sending a replacement tonight." Mrs. Brooks answered immediately. "I don't need overnight shipping." He frowned. "Then what do you need?" Silence. Then the older woman said softly, "Just don't disappear again." Richard lowered his eyes. "No, Ma." The call ended 4 minutes later. Nobody spoke. The room stayed quiet long enough for the air conditioning to become audible again. Josh finally looked up. The video comments changed. Martha turned. He enlarged the feed. "Maybe give them time." She talked to the CEO. "Keep watching. Hope they mean it." Richard remained seated. His hand still rested on the file. Annie looked at him. "You okay?" He stared at the papers, then answered without looking up. "She thought we stopped caring." Nobody spoke, because everybody in that room knew she had been right. Richard slowly closed the file, then stood. "Mrs. Brooks gets replacement delivery tonight." Nancy nodded. He looked around the room, and every customer like her. David opened his mouth. Richard stopped him with a look. No more delays. Martha already started typing. Josh updated the tracker. Nancy moved the Ohio case to active recovery. Richard looked once more at the whiteboard. "We show up." This time he did not read it like a slogan. He read it like an obligation. And Annie, standing beside the table, understood something for the first time that day. The company was changing. But the harder thing was happening too. The man running it was starting to change with it. The company was changing. But the harder thing was happening too. The man running it was starting to change with it. Richard remained standing beside the table after the call ended. Nobody interrupted him. The room had settled into a strange rhythm now. Phones. Notes. Customer names. Updates. The panic from the morning had turned into work. Nancy moved another case into active recovery. Josh refreshed the sentiment tracker. Martha sat with her glasses in one hand, staring at the Ohio file still lying open near Richard. David was the first to break the silence. "We need to talk about the board." Richard did not look up. "The board can wait." "No." Richard finally turned. David stepped closer. "They already gave you one afternoon. Investors are calling. Retail partners are asking questions. The media cycle won't stay friendly forever." "Friendly?" Martha looked up. "Nobody's being friendly." David ignored her. Richard picked up Mrs. Brooks' file and closed it. "What are the numbers?" Josh answered from the screen. Negative sentiment still leads, but falling. Neutral climbed 15%. Positive response doubled. David folded his arms. That means nothing if delivery fails tonight. The room quieted, because everyone knew he was right. Richard looked toward Nancy. Status on replacements? Nancy opened the logistics dashboard, then froze. Martha noticed immediately. What? Nancy clicked again. Nothing changed. She clicked a third time. Oh no. Richard stepped closer. The dashboard showed red. Delayed. Pending. Route conflicts. Replacement shipments held. Richard's face hardened. What happened? Nancy swallowed. The warehouses. David frowned. What about them? Nancy looked up. The replacement teams are overloaded. Josh pulled another screen. More alerts. Midwest distribution backlog. Emergency dispatch delays. Ohio replacement queue suspended. The room fell silent. Mrs. Brooks's replacement. Still pending. Richard stared at the screen. Tonight, he said quietly. Nancy nodded without looking up. It won't make tonight. Nobody moved. Martha slowly stood. Can we reroute? Nancy checked. No drivers available. Private carriers? Booked. David exhaled. There it is. Richard turned. The wall. Nobody answered, because everyone understood. The apology worked. The calls worked. Now reality arrived. Logistics. Distance. People. Annie stepped toward the screen. Who handles special delivery? Nancy blinked. We don't have special delivery. Who handles executive travel? The room turned. David frowned immediately. No. Richard looked at Annie. She pointed at the Ohio file. Your jet. Silence. Josh looked up so fast his chair squeaked. Martha stared. David laughed once. No. Annie kept looking at Richard. You said no customer gets left unanswered. Richard did not move. David stepped in. Absolutely not. Corporate aircraft are not emergency logistics. No, Annie said. They're transportation. Richard still watched her. Annie continued. One replacement shipment, one customer, one promise. David shook his head. This is ridiculous. Is it? Annie looked toward the screen. Mrs. Brooks' case still glowed red. Pending. You already called her. Richard said nothing. You told her you wouldn't disappear again. The room stayed still. David turned to Richard. Do not even think about it. Richard looked at the Ohio file, then at the whiteboard. We show up. No customer left unanswered. Martha quietly asked, how far is Ohio? Nancy checked. Flight time under 2 hours. David closed his folder sharply. This is becoming theater. Richard looked at him. No. His voice was calm. This became personal. Nobody spoke. Richard picked up the file. Nancy. Yes, sir? Prepare the shipment. David stared. You are not serious. Richard turned. I spent 20 years teaching this company that money fixes everything. He looked at the red dashboard. Today I'm trying something else. David said nothing, because for the first time all day he had no argument left. Josh quietly whispered, This is insane. Martha answered without looking away. No. Her eyes stayed on Richard. This is leadership. Richard ignored both of them. He walked toward the window. Manhattan glowed beneath the late afternoon sun. Hours ago, he had stood in the same place asking how much money it would take to make people stop talking. Now he was planning a delivery run. He almost laughed at himself. The door opened. The assistant stepped in again. Mr. Whitmore? He turned. Media update. The networks want a second appearance. Richard shook his head. No interviews. The assistant blinked. Sit. Richard handed him Mrs. Brooks' file. Tell them I'm busy. The assistant looked confused. With what? Richard glanced toward Annie, then back at the file, keeping a promise. The room stayed quiet after he left. Nancy started issuing instructions. Josh updated logistics. Martha began drafting the internal rollout. David stood motionless near the window. Annie remained beside the table. Richard walked over. You know something? She looked up. What? You are very expensive for someone who doesn't work here. Annie smiled despite herself. You still have the coffee tray. Richard almost smiled back. Almost. Then Nancy called out. Ohio package ready. Richard straightened. Good. He picked up his jacket. David looked up immediately. You're really going? Richard buttoned the coat. Yes. The lawyer stared at him. The CEO of Whitmore Consumer Group is flying a replacement shipment to Ohio. Richard walked toward the door. No. Everyone looked up. He opened it. The man who made the promise is. Then he stepped out. The room remained silent for several seconds. Martha looked at Annie. You realize this stopped being a media strategy 3 hours ago? Annie watched the closed door. Yes. What is it now? Annie looked toward the whiteboard. We show up, then quietly answered. Proof. Proof. The words stayed in the room after Richard left. Nobody joked. Nobody argued. The conference room that had spent the morning talking about damage control was now watching the CEO carry a replacement shipment to Ohio himself. Josh looked toward the closed door. Did that really happen? Martha closed her laptop halfway. Yes. Nancy continued typing. He took the case file too. David stood near the window with both hands in his pockets. This company has lost its mind. No, Martha said quietly. It found one. David looked at her. She returned to work. Annie moved toward the customer board. The red indicators had dropped. Not enough, but enough to notice. Josh refreshed the feed again. More posts appeared. The CEO called my parents. Still waiting, but at least they answered. Maybe they mean it. Nancy looked up. The callback queue dropped below 200. Nobody celebrated. There was still too much left. Annie pulled another file from the stack. Michigan. Elderly couple. Shipment missing. Follow-up pending. She carried it to Nancy. Who has this one? Nancy checked. Regional. Move it here. Nancy paused, then nodded. David watched the exchange. You're assigning cases now? Annie looked at him. No. Then what? I'm helping. David opened his mouth. Stopped, because there was nothing wrong with the answer. The door opened. One of the younger assistants rushed in holding a phone. Martha. She looked up. Media update. Martha took the phone. Her expression changed. What? Josh stood. What happened? Martha turned the screen. Live video. Airport footage. Someone had already spotted Richard. He stood beside the company jet carrying a shipping box with a Whitmore label. The clip already had hundreds of thousands of views. Josh whispered, "No way." Comments flooded underneath. That's the CEO? He's carrying it himself? Please tell me this isn't staged. David stepped closer. This is bad. Nobody answered. He looked around. Seriously? Nobody sees the risk? Martha looked at the video. Richard placing the box inside the aircraft. No cameras from the company. No press release. No logo wall. Just a man carrying a package. She looked back at David. I see the risk. And? I think he does too. The room quieted. Josh refreshed again. Another post. Someone at the airport filmed Richard speaking with ground staff. No entourage. No executives. Just him. Nancy slowly sat down. I've worked here 17 years. Everyone looked up. I've never seen him carry anything. Silence. Annie looked at the screen again. The clip passed 2 million views. Comments changed. Maybe he means it. Wait and see. Still not forgiving them. Good. The room stayed busy. Phones rang. Files moved. Martha started drafting the internal rollout for WE Show Up. Nancy coordinated dispatch teams. Josh monitored the feeds. Annie sorted cases. Nobody asked her to stop. Nobody asked whose job it was. After a while, Martha looked over. You missed lunch. Annie glanced up. It's fine. No. Martha opened a paper bag near her chair. Turkey sandwich. Apple. Chips. She slid it over. Eat. Annie hesitated. I'm okay. That wasn't a question. Josh smiled without looking up. Welcome to communications. Annie took the bag quietly. The apple reminded her she had not eaten since morning. David watched the exchange, then looked away. His phone rang. Board member. He answered near the window. Yes. Pause. No, he left. Pause again. David glanced toward the room. No. He's delivering a replacement package. Long silence on the other end. Josh tried not to laugh. David pinched the bridge of his nose. Yes, he said flatly. I'm aware of how that sounds. He ended the call. Nobody asked. The answer was already on his face. The board was shocked. Josh refreshed again. Another alert. Martha turned. What now? Josh enlarged the screen. Local Ohio news. Breaking banner. Whitmore CEO en route to customer delivery. The room went silent. Nancy whispered, That fast? Josh nodded. Airport video spread. David sat down for the first time all day. The room looked different now. Tired. Messu. Real. The coffee on the side table had gone cold hours ago. The reports Richard waved in Annie's face that morning were still stacked untouched near the end of the table. Nobody had opened them since. Annie noticed. So did Martha. The older woman smiled faintly. Funny. Annie looked up. What? Martha nodded toward the papers. This morning those were the most important thing in the room. Annie followed her eyes. And now? Martha looked at the customer board. The names. The callbacks. The promises. The people are. Nobody argued. Because nobody could. Josh suddenly straightened. Wait. The room turned. New upload. Live stream from Ohio. Small local station. Reporter outside a one-story house. Driveway. American flag near the porch. Delivery vehicle arriving. The room stood. Even David. The camera zoomed. Richard stepped out carrying the replacement box himself. Nobody in the conference room spoke. The reporter approached. Mr. Whitmore. Why are you here personally? Richard stopped. He looked at the house. Then answered. Because we should have shown up sooner. The room fell silent. Martha lowered her eyes. Nancy stopped typing. Josh forgot the keyboard. Annie watched the screen. The man who had asked how much it cost to make people stop talking was now standing in front of a stranger's house carrying a box. David looked at the live feed, then quietly said something nobody expected. She was right. Nobody asked who. Nobody needed to. Across the room, Annie sat back down, still wearing the intern badge, still in the borrowed blazer, but nothing about her place in that room was the same anymore. The live feed from Ohio stayed on the screen. Richard stood on the porch holding the replacement box while the local reporter remained several steps behind. The front door opened. Mrs. Brooks appeared. Silver hair, blue cardigan, one hand still holding the screen door. The conference room went quiet again. Nobody sat down. Mrs. Brooks looked at the box first, then at Richard. You actually came? Richard nodded. Yes, ma'am. The reporter stayed back. No microphone pushed forward. No dramatic music. Just two people on a porch. Mrs. Brooks opened the door wider. You drove all this way for a box? Richard looked down at it. No. The room listened. I came because I should have called sooner. Silence. Even Josh stopped typing. Mrs. Brooks looked at him for several seconds, then stepped aside. Well, she said, standing outside won't help either of us. The conference room exchanged looks. Martha slowly sat back down. The local camera remained outside, but the microphone caught pieces of conversation through the open doorway. Mrs. Brooks speaking, Richard answering. No polished lines. No company language. Just voices. David stared at the screen. This woman is stronger than half our executives. Nancy smiled without looking up. Most nurses are. David turned. Nancy kept working. The live feed cut briefly to the reporter. Mr. Whitmore requested no press access inside the house. The room looked up. Martha folded her arms. He turned down coverage? Josh checked social media. Apparently. David looked genuinely confused. Why? Annie answered quietly. Because this part isn't for the cameras. Nobody argued. 20 minutes later, the live feed ended. The room returned to work. Phones. Cases. Callbacks. The rhythm resumed. Then Josh's monitor chimed. Once. Twice. 5 times. He frowned. What now? The screen refreshed. New posts. Photos. Ohio. Martha walked over. The first image appeared. Mrs. Brooks standing on her porch. Richard beside her. No box. Just conversation. The caption read, He stayed. The room went silent. Josh opened another post. Different angle. Mrs. Brooks laughing. Richard holding a coffee mug. Caption, Did not expect this. Nancy lowered her headset. He stayed? Josh nodded. The comments exploded. Maybe they're serious. This feels different. Keep watching. David sat down slowly. Martha looked toward Annie. She was right again. Annie shook her head. No. Martha smiled. Yes. Before Annie could answer, Nancy looked at the customer board. Her expression changed. What? Josh turned. Nancy pointed. Ohio cases. Green. All of them. Martha stood. How? Nancy checked the updates. Regional teams. Emergency reroutes. Drivers reassigned. The Ohio team moved on their own. Josh looked surprised. They followed. Nobody needed clarification. We show up. The message had spread, not because headquarters ordered it, because people started believing it. The room stayed quiet. Then David spoke. Richard changed the company in one afternoon. Annie looked at the board. No. David turned. She pointed at the names. The customers changed it. Nancy nodded. Martha, too. David looked away. His phone rang. Board member again. He answered, yes. Pause. Another pause. His face changed. What? Everyone looked over. David lowered the phone slowly. The board wants Annie. Silence. Annie blinked. Me? David nodded. Emergency executive session. Josh nearly dropped his tablet. Nancy looked up. Martha folded her arms. Annie stood there, still wearing the same badge. Communications interne. David looked at it, then at Hare. They want the person who started this. The room stayed quiet. Martha walked over. You should go. Annie looked toward the door. What would I even say? Martha smiled faintly. The same thing you said this morning. Annie frowned. I called their CEO a fool. No. Martha shook her head. You told the truth in a room where nobody else would. The board call started 10 minutes later. Large screen. 5 faces. Same people from earlier. Different expressions now. No impatience. No confusion. The older woman spoke first. Miss Carter. Annie straightened. Yes, ma'am. We reviewed the timeline. Annie waited. The woman continued. The live stream. The callbacks. The recovery model. Ohio. She paused. Was all of this really your idea? Annie hesitated. No, ma'am. The board members looked at each other. Annie glanced toward the customer board behind her. The people told us what they needed. Silence. Then the older man adjusted his glasses. And you listened? Annie said nothing, because that was the answer. The board woman nodded slowly. Interesting. The screen went quiet. Then another board member leaned forward. What are you doing after this internship? The room stopped. Josh froze. Nancy looked up. Martha slowly smiled. Annie blinked. What? The board member repeated calmly. What are your plans after this? Before Annie answered, the conference room door opened. Richard walked in. Everyone turned. His coat was off. His tie gone. He looked tired. The room stayed silent. He glanced at the screen. The board. Then at Annie. Then at the question still hanging in the room. He understood immediately. The older woman smiled. Perfect timing, Richard. He walked in slowly. What did I miss? The board member answered without hesitation. We're discussing whether your intern should stay. We're discussing whether your intern should stay. The room went silent. Richard stood near the door with his coat over one arm. He looked from the board screen to Annie, then to the intern badge still clipped to her blazer. Nobody moved. The older board member spoke again. She built the response model. Richard walked slowly toward the table. She corrected it. The woman smiled slightly. Modest. No, Richard said. Accurate. Martha looked up. So did David. Richard put the Ohio file down. She didn't build the crisis plan. She reminded us we had forgotten people. The board members exchanged glances. One of the men leaned forward. Richard, do you know what your approval numbers look like tonight? Richard sat down. I don't care. That answer surprised everyone. Even him. The older man smiled. That's why they're improving. Josh quietly checked the feed again. He looked up. Nobody reacted. Josh turned the monitor. National headlines. Whitmore CEO delivers replacement personally. CEO apology shifts public response. Customers report direct callbacks. Martha sat back. David looked at the headlines for a long moment. Then away. The board woman looked toward Annie. You changed the narrative. Annie shook her head. No, ma'am. The woman waited. Annie looked at the customer board. The customers changed it. We just stopped interrupting them. Silence. Richard watched her. The same woman who had stood beside a coffee tray this morning was now answering board questions like she belonged there. The older board member adjusted his glasses. What do you want after graduation? Annie blinked. I haven't really planned that far. Why not? Annie hesitated. The room listened. Because people like me usually plan one step at a time. Nobody answered. Not immediately. Richard looked down at the table. The board woman asked quietly, people like you? Annie looked at the screen. People who grow up learning opportunities can disappear. The room stayed still. She continued before she could stop herself. You learn not to dream too far ahead. Martha lowered her eyes. Nancy stopped typing. Richard looked at Annie differently then. Not as the intern. Not as the girl who challenged him. As someone who had walked into the building expecting to disappear. The board member spoke again. Well, she smiled. I think we should interrupt that plan. A light knock came at the door. The assistant entered holding another tablet. Mr. Whitmore. Richard looked up. Media update? No, sir. The assistant looked surprised himself. The stock recovered. Silence. Josh turned immediately. His fingers moved. The graph refreshed. Whitmore Consumer Group. Down 6% that morning. Now climbing. The room stared. David stepped closer. That can't be right. Josh refreshed again. Saw a result. Martha looked at Richard. He did not react. The assistant continued. Investors are calling it a trust rebound. Nobody spoke, because the phrase sounded impossible. Trust rebound. Not market recovery. Not crisis containment. Trust. Richard slowly sat back. The board members smiled. One of them laughed softly. 40 years in business and I've never seen that headline. The older woman turned toward Richard. Keep the girl. The room went quiet again. Richard looked at Annie. She looked ready to speak. He raised one hand. Wait. Annie stopped. Richard stood. He walked toward the whiteboard. We show up. No customer left unanswered. He looked at the words for several seconds, then turned. This morning, he said quietly, I asked how much money it would take to make people stop talking. Nobody moved. I was wrong. Martha looked down. Nancy smiled faintly. David stayed still. Richard looked at Annie. You called me a fool. Josh almost laughed, remembering it. Richard continued. You were right. The room remained silent, because nobody expected him to say it out loud. Not the board. Not David. Not Annie. Richard reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out an envelope and placed it on the table. Annie frowned. What is that? Open it. She looked at him, then opened it. Inside was a check. Her eyes widened. The room stayed quiet. It's a bonus, Richard said. Annie looked up immediately. I can't take this. Yes, you can. No, sir. You saved my company. Annie shook her head. No, the customers saved it. Richard almost smiled. See? That right there. She looked confused. You still think like a human being before an employee. The room softened. Richard nodded toward the check. Take it. Annie looked down again. The amount sat there quietly. Enough to change things. Enough to breathe. Martha looked away to give her privacy. Richard spoke again. It's not hush money. Annie looked up. A faint smile crossed his face. I learned that lesson already. Josh laughed first. Then Martha. Even David looked like he almost did. Richard reached into the folder beside him. He pulled out one more document. This time he placed it directly in front of Annie. She looked down. Her hands stopped moving. Special Communications Advisor to the CEO. The room went completely silent. Anya started. What is this? Richard sat down again. A bad decision. Everyone looked at him. He glanced toward the board screen. They wanted to keep the intern. Then he looked back at Annie. I need the person who told me I was wrong. Nobody moved. The board members smiled. Martha folded her arms and looked suspiciously proud. Nancy quietly wiped one eye. David stared at the title. Annie still had not spoken. Richard leaned back. You don't have to answer now. She looked up. Why me? He answered immediately. Because everyone else in this building knew how to protect me. His eyes moved toward the whiteboard. You knew how to stop me. The room stayed quiet. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed under the evening sky. Inside the conference room, the coffee had gone cold hours ago. The reports still sat untouched, and the intern badge on Annie's blazer suddenly felt too small for the room she was standing in. The intern badge on Annie's blazer suddenly felt too small for the room she was standing in. Nobody spoke for several seconds. The papers still lay in front of her. Special Communications Advisor to the CEO. The words looked unreal. Annie touched the edge of the document but did not pick it up. Richard watched quietly. The board members remained on screen. Martha sat with both arms folded. Nancy kept pretending to organize files even though she had not moved the same paper in a full minute. David looked toward the window. Annie finally lifted her eyes. You're serious? Richard nodded. Yes. You met me this morning. You corrected me this morning. That's not the same thing. No, Richard said. It isn't. The room stayed quiet. Annie looked back at the paper. You don't know me. Richard leaned back. I know you stood in a room full of people older than you, richer than you, more powerful than you, and still told the truth. He glanced at the whiteboard. Most executives fail that test. Nobody argued. Not even David. Annie looked down again. The check still sat beside the offer. Enough money to help her mother. Enough to breathe. Enough to stop calculating every expense. She closed the envelope. I still have school. Richard nodded. Keep it. I still have this internship because I needed experience. Keep that too. Annie blinked. He almost smiled. I own the building. We can be flexible. The room laughed softly. Even Annie. The tension finally cracked. Josh checked the analytics again. Guys. Nobody turned immediately. Then Josh frowned. Wait. Martha stood. What happened? He rotated the monitor. The customer dashboard refreshed. Priority cases. Open this morning, 312. Remaining, 18. The room went still. Nancy whispered. No way. She checked manually. Same number. Richard looked over. 18? Nancy nodded. Teams kept moving. Martha smiled. They believed it. Nobody needed clarification. We show up. The words had left the conference room. They were moving through warehouses, dispatch centers, customer lines, and regional offices. People had started acting differently. Josh opened social feeds again. More videos. Deliveries arriving. Customers answering phones. Regional managers helping unload replacements. One post sat at the top. My mom finally got help tonight. The photo showed an elderly woman holding a replacement unit while a delivery worker stood beside her smiling awkwardly. The caption ended with 4 words. They actually showed up. Nancy lowered her head. Richard looked at the screen for a long moment, then quietly sat down. The room noticed. He looked tired. Not crisis tired. Human tired. Martha walked over. You should go home. No. You've been here all day. He looked toward the remaining cases. 18. We can finish. Richard shook his head. No customer left unanswered. Martha smiled faintly. You really memorized it. He looked at the board. No. His eyes moved toward Annie. I got reminded. The board woman on screen leaned forward. Richard. He looked up. You know what this means? He frowned slightly. What? She smiled. You survived. Silence. Richard looked at the customer wall, then at the reports still stacked untouched at the end of the table. The same reports he had waved in Annie's face that morning. He walked over, picked them up, looked at them, then set them down again. Nobody spoke, because everyone remembered. The shouting, the stopwatch. Only a fool solves it your way. Richard turned toward Annie. You know something? She looked up. What? If you had said that to me yesterday? Josh grinned. Martha already knew where this was going. Richard folded his arms. I would have fired you before lunch. The room laughed. Annie smiled. I know. No. Richard shook his head. You don't. He looked around the room. At 10 this morning, I thought this company needed silence. His eyes moved to the whiteboard. At 10 tonight. He stopped. The room waited. Richard looked at Annie. I think it needed honesty. Nobody moved, because it sounded simple. But everyone in that room knew how hard it had been for him to say. Josh suddenly refreshed the tracker again. The room turned. He smiled. Last update. Nancy stood. Priority cases remaining. 0. Silence. Then Martha sat back in her chair and laughed quietly. Nancy actually clapped once before covering her mouth. Josh raised both hands. David exhaled like he had been holding air all day. Richard stared at the screen. 0. No customer left unanswered. He looked toward Annie, then at the offer letter still lying in front of her, the intern badge still clipped to her blazer, the cold coffee on the side table, the untouched reports. Everything from this morning still existed, but none of it meant the same thing anymore. Richard walked back to the table. He took the intern badge gently between 2 fingers. Annie looked up. He turned it over once. Communications interne. Then he set it down beside the new title. You outgrew this today. The room went quiet again. Outside the windows, Manhattan glowed beneath the night sky. Inside, the crisis was ending. But something else had begun, and everybody in that room knew it. And everybody in that room knew it. The customer board still showed 0. No customer left unanswered. Nobody wanted to erase it. The phones had gone quiet for the first time all day. The giant conference room that had started with shouting, panic, and legal reports now looked like the end of a storm. Open files. Empty coffee cups. Jackets over chairs. The city lights outside had turned the glass walls into mirrors. Richard stood at the table looking at Annie's badge beside the new title. Communications interne. Special communications advisor to the CEO. The distance between those 2 lines felt impossible. Annie finally picked up the offer letter. Her hands were steady now. Richard watched her. So? Josh asked quietly. Martha elbowed him without looking. What? Let her breathe. Annie smiled a little, then looked at Richard. You really mean this? Yes. You're not doing it because today went well? No. Because the board said so? No. She lowered the paper. Then why? Richard looked around the room. At Martha, Nancy, Josh, David. The customer board. The whiteboard. We show up. Then he looked back at Annie. Because this morning you walked into a room where everyone was trying to protect me. The room stayed quiet. You were the only person trying to stop me. Nobody moved. Richard continued. You didn't protect my ego. You protected the company. Annie looked down. He pointed toward the reports stacked near the end of the table. I waved those papers in your face. Josh smiled. Richard did too. A lot, apparently. A few people laughed. He continued. I thought experience meant I had all the answers. His eyes moved toward the whiteboard. Turns out experience just means you have more chances to get comfortable being wrong. Martha lowered her head. Nancy smiled faintly. Even David looked tired enough to agree. Annie folded the offer letter carefully. I'll accept. The room broke. Josh actually clapped. Nancy hugged her before realizing she had done it. Martha smiled openly for the first time all day. The board members applauded from the screen. Richard sat down. Not because he planned to. Because relief finally reached him. The board woman laughed softly. You look exhausted. Richard nodded. I am. You should be. You almost drove your company off a cliff. Josh winced. Richard looked toward Annie. She told me that too. Annie smiled. No. I called you a fool. The room laughed again. Even David. Richard shook his head. Still can't believe you said that. You deserved it. I did. The answer came so quickly the room quieted again. Richard leaned back. For the record, I hated you for about 20 minutes. Josh nearly choked laughing. Martha covered her mouth. Annie blinked. Only 20? Richard looked at her. You fixed it too fast. The room softened. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved under the night sky. Inside, the assistant stepped in again. Mr. Whitmore? He looked up. Sorry to interrupt. You already did. The assistant smiled awkwardly. Market close report. Richard took it, opened it, read it, then put it down. Martha watched him. Well? He looked toward the room. Stock recovered. Josh raised both hands. Nancy smiled. Richard continued. Board vote postponed. David frowned. Why? Richard looked at Annie. They want to see what happens next. Nobody missed the meaning. Not the company. Here. The board screen disconnected one by one until only the conference room remained. Quiet. Real. Late. Martha gathered her things. Nancy shut down the support boards. Josh packed cables. David took his folder. One by one they left. Eventually only Annie and Richard remained. The city reflected behind them. Richard picked up the cold coffee cup, sitting near the side table. The same one from the morning. Untouched. He looked at it. You know what's funny? Annie shook her head. This cup sat here all day. He turned it slowly. This morning I thought the biggest problem in my company was public relations. He set it down. It wasn't. Annie waited. Richard looked toward the whiteboard one last time. It was me. The room went quiet. He turned back. You saved me from something worse than losing money. Annie frowned slightly. What? Myself. The answer stayed between them. Then Richard reached into the folder beside him. He pulled out a new badge. No ceremony. No speech. He placed it in front of her. Special Communications Advisor to the CEO. Annie stared at it. Her old badge still lay beside it. Richard nodded toward both. Take whichever one you want. Annie looked down, then picked up the new one. Richard smiled. Good choice. A phone buzzed. Annie checked it. Message from Mom. You okay, baby? She looked at the screen for a second, then typed back. I think they heard me today. She slipped the phone into her pocket. Richard picked up his coat. Together they walked toward the door. At the threshold, Annie looked back once. The whiteboard still stood there. We show up. The reports remained untouched. The coffee had gone cold. The crisis was over. But the lesson stayed. People do not remember every apology. They remember who showed up after it. And sometimes a company does not change because of consultants, money, or strategy. Sometimes it changes because one person standing beside a coffee cart refuses to stay silent. The girl who walked into the building as an intern left it as something else. Not because a billionaire promoted her, because she made him listen. This story reminds us that leadership is not measured by power, wealth, or titles. It is measured by the courage to listen when others stay silent and the humility to admit when we are wrong. Annie proved that truth can come from the quietest person in the room, while Richard learned that people do not expect perfection, they expect respect, honesty, and accountability. The story also speaks to a deeper lesson. Companies, leaders, and even society begin to change the moment we stop treating people like numbers and start seeing them as human beings. In the end, real trust is not bought with money. It is earned by showing up when it matters most. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.